come on. So good evening, everybody. Very, very nice to see so many people coming on to this. This is a special evening that we are having to connect our diocesan assembly process, which lots of you have been very involved with, that we had back in July, with everything that was going on in Rome and that global synod process. And somebody who's been absolutely at the heart of that, one of the group that was authoring the enlarged space of the tent, one of the group working in Rome, an expert invited by Pope Francis to be part of the Rome Synod, is Austen Ivereigh, a name very well known to lots of you. He co-authored with Pope Francis the Let Us Dream book that came out, and that I remember walking into a secular bookshop and seeing it on the side in a secular bookshop thinking, my gosh, I don't think I've ever seen kind of a papal document just sat on the side as a kind of a buy this for a Christmas present for somebody. It was quite something. Austin's also been a papal biographer of Pope Francis and really has got a sense of his thought that not so many people have. So Austin, I'm absolutely delighted and thrilled to have you with us this evening, and I know there was much excitement about having you in the diocese, so thank you so much. And just for the sake of everybody this evening, our format is going to be that we're going to hear from Austen for about 45 minutes, and we'll have some questions at the end. If you've got questions, I think what we'll probably do, just so that we can get through as many people as possible. We've actually got loads of people joining us this evening. You can see already we've got more than 40 people. Just so we can get through as many questions as possible. If you put them in the chat, and then if we need to kind of get you to explain it a bit more, we can get people to unmute. But that just means I can bundle them up and we can get through as many as possible. Just before we start, should we just have a moment of prayer? And I'm gonna. I always hate this bit when I'm also letting people into the call, so I'm keeping my eyes open at this point so I don't leave people hanging in the waiting room. So, in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Father God, we thank you that you are moving in our diocese in such a special way, and we thank you that you have been pouring out your Holy Spirit on us. And we ask you once again to be with us as we gather this evening in this special space, that we might have hearts for listening and mouths for speaking, and hearts that are burning to build your kingdom in our diocese. We ask this through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. In the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. So Austen.
Great. Lovely to be with you, Avril, and it's great to meet all of you online, as it were. Northampton is a great example to us all in everything you've been doing, that assembly last July. So it's great to make contact with you. I'm not so far away in the English periphery of Cardiff Archdiocese. I'm in Herefordshire, which is a kind of Benedictine fiefdom on the periphery of Cardiff. So we're have to say we look across to Northampton with some envy and admiration for how you're kicking everything off. So great to be with you. I'm going to talk about the Synod Assembly mostly in October, which I was at as an expert theologian. I put this in heavy inverted commas. I had a little sign, actually. We all had badges and it said expert on it. And I phoned my wife and said, finally, you see, recognize. And I'll explain what I did exactly, what I was doing there and what my role was. But really, this whole synodal process from the beginning of the Synod on Synodality, when it was launched in October 21 through to now, my role has been to help with the process of synthesizing, so reading lots of documents and doing that task of extracting from what we read, which is a task of discernment. What are the convergences? Where is there a convergence? And where are the tensions? Where are the divergences? Where also are the prophetic voices? And it's been fascinating to be involved first at the national stage of England, as part of the England and Wales synthesis group, then to be in Frascati, as Avril mentioned, drawing up the so-called document for the continental stage, where we read all of the Bishops' Conference documents from the entire world. Not all of us read all of them. That would have been impossible. But between us, we did. In fact, each document was read 4 times. And that was fascinating to be with an international group, having these, doing this globally, having this global perspective. And then, as you know, it went to the continental stage. I wasn't involved in that. I wasn't at the assembly in Prague, but then I was called to be part of the group in the Synod Assembly in October. So the more I've been involved with this, the more convinced I've become that this is an extraordinary moment in the life of the church and an extraordinary gift that we need for our time. And I don't want to sort of do too much by way of a preamble, but I mean, it is obvious, I think, to most of us that we are both in wider society and in our church in this sort of inflection point, transition, time of crisis, whatever you want to call it, where things that we have inherited from the past no longer seem to be working. And we are about discovering what it is that we need to do to change. And of course, it's becoming harder and harder to bring people together, both in society and in our church, to bring them together to come to a common mind. This is one of the characteristics of our age, is this growing polarization and tribalization, where it's becoming harder to have the kind of civil dialogues that produce the consensus that then enables us to act together to solve common problems. So what we're seeing in wider society, the kind of breakdown of democracies and the old politics, as it were, we're also seeing within the church. You know, I'd never imagined in my time I would see, you know, the division of Catholics into these camps, these warring camps, so deeply kind of hostile to each other. So and of course, as this is happening in the West, we're also, as a church, and this was really apparent to me in the assembly, we are becoming a global church, a multipolar church. You know, it's no longer, the church is essentially a Western institution with, you know, missions. It's now multipolar in the same way that we live in a multipolar world. It's no longer a Western world that dominates, but we have these different centers of dominance and power. So the question more and more becomes, how do we come to a common mind about anything? Or to put this in a theological way, you know, how do we discover what it is that the Spirit is calling us to? What are the processes which enable that? And so the more I've been involved in this process, the more I've come to understand that this ancient practice of synodality is, well, it is the great gift that, if you like, Jesus left the church. You know, I will not leave you orphans. He promises his disciples, the Spirit will lead you into the truth. I will send you the Spirit will lead you into truth. And synodality is really the mechanism, the means, the process by which the early church comes to discover what it is that the Spirit is saying to them, because Jesus is no longer around. It's not clear. There are times of confusion and darkness, and we're in one of them. Unquestionably, we're in one of them right now. There was a German bishop at the Synod Assembly who, he didn't say this in the assembly actually, but in a press conference, which is why I'm free to repeat it. But he described how, since becoming a bishop, I think 10, 11 years ago, he had ordained 15 men to the priesthood, and he had buried 300 priests. Yeah? And what he was saying, which was actually quite similar, even though from a completely different perspective, to what an African bishop was saying at some point in the assembly when he was describing what it was like to minister to this vast rural diocese with, you know, just a tiny handful of priests. Now, in the case of the African bishop, he was talking about a church that is in rapid growth. You know, it's young, seminaries are full, vocations and so on, but they lack resources. And the German bishop, of course, talking from a country which is very wealthy, and the church in Germany is extremely wealthy. And yet the institution is no longer attractive. It's no longer attracting vocations. But they're really both saying the same thing, which is that the model that so many of us have inherited, you know, the model that we think about when we think about the church, which is often sort of a post-1950s model, isn't it? You know, where there's a priest in every parish, where there are religious vocations everywhere. That model is gone. You know, it's not just going, it is kind of gone. And I became really more aware of this at the assembly. So just to stand back from this is also about a search for a way in which the church can understand, can reconnect with the age in which we're living in, and to understand that the church needs to change, as it has always needed to change, in order to proclaim the gospel to the society in which it's living in. So this is all about changing in order to carry out the mission that Jesus entrusted the church with. And so I don't know whether you've heard the expression sometimes that it's not so much that the church has a mission, but that the mission has a church. In other words, the church flows from the mission that Christ entrusts to his disciples. And that church, the way we configure ministries and the priesthood and parishes and so on, is going to change. It's going to be different in different eras. And we're now in one of these eras of transition. And synodality is the great gift, the ancient gift of the church that allows us, if you like, to get there. So it's a way of traveling into the future so that we become the church which the Spirit is calling us to be. And we do so, and this is really important, without schism, without separating from each other, but rather by growing ever more in communion. And this is, as you've already experienced in the diocese, not easy. Synodality requires hard work, it requires patience, and it requires faith, it requires trust. And it's trust in that process. It's trust in that actually what Jesus says is true, that the Spirit will lead us into the truth. It's very interesting to me how the Synod has been criticized from the beginning, the Synod on Synodality, I mean, from the very beginning has been criticized, hasn't it, from both sides, and I don't want to caricature anybody here, but, we have the traditionalist critique and we have the progressive critique. And one is accusing the Synod of changing doctrine and of selling out the church's tradition to the spirit of the age. And the other is accusing the church of failing to adapt to the requirements of modernity in the modern age. And one is accusing the church of, accusing the Synod of changing doctrine, the other is saying that it's not changing anything, that is all still in the hands of the bishops. But what fascinates me about both critiques is the assumption that whatever they believe should be done can be resolved through a kind of centralist authoritarian diktat. There was a moment when I was coming out of the assembly at the end of October, and we had just produced the synthesis document, and a very progressive, I would call him American, I would better not say who he was, just came up to me and said, "I can't believe that you made it so weak, the document, on women, on women's ordination or ordination to the diaconate. I can't believe you didn't go further." In other words, accusing me, because he knew I was involved in the synthesis process, of failing to do what he believed was expected of us. But in what world did he expect that somehow a group of us could impose something that did not come out of that assembly? And I realized then that there is this instinct and perhaps it's in all of us, and particularly in Catholics, to believe that, well, what's the problem? The Pope can solve this tomorrow by just ordering it done. But here's what I learned in the assembly, which is that you can't do that without generating division and schism, because the differences between us are so great. And they're real human differences. They're cultural differences, but they're differences of point of view. But when I was in that assembly, it was really the most diverse, global gathering that the church, I think, has ever had in its history. Somebody said that at some point, and I'm sure that's right. And just to realize this astonishing differences around the world, just in the way people see things, the way they have experienced the church is so radically different. I kept thinking, it is amazing that we can do this. It is amazing that we can have these conversations and these processes which allow us to come to a common mind. And the remarkable thing is that at the end of this assembly, that document, the synthesis document, which I'll put the link to in a minute, was voted for by well, at least 95%. Every single paragraph was voted on, and every single paragraph except for 3 got more than 90% of approval. And 3 paragraphs got, well, they still got 80%. I mean, these are huge majorities of the kinds that you saw at the Second Vatican Council. So just to have this process that concluded, even though it decides nothing, that moved to this consensus that everybody could say, or almost everybody at the end of that assembly could say, yes, this document captures what happened. Yes, this is what we think should happen. And above all, to say that synodality is the way forward. They say 2 very important things in the synthesis document. One is that synodality belongs to the tradition of the church. It is part of the Catholic DNA. And secondly, it is the future. So it is both tradition and it is the future. Was, in a sense, extraordinary. I'm going to just share a few slides, if I may now, because it helps to have a few pictures of what happened and saves you looking endlessly at me. Now, where's that thing that says share screen? Just a second. I thought I saw it earlier. Show captions, record, share screen. Got it. Okay, just a second. Let me just press play. So just so you know, as I'm sure this is obvious to you, but just so you understand that the assembly in October is part of the 3-year process, which began in October 2021 with the diocesan or national stage, in which, of course, you were all involved, which resulted in that Bishops' Conference report that I talked about earlier. And then we had the continental stage, where we had assemblies of the people of God held on 7 continents. And this is important for what happened in October. 7 continents, which aren't necessarily geographical continents, but they're continents as far as Rome is concerned. And that those supranational continental ecclesial bodies like CELAM, CCEE, SECAM, bodies you've probably never heard of, organized these assemblies, which was itself significant. It gave, if you like, the local church, regional church, a significant voice. Each of those assemblies, which were assemblies of the people of God, they weren't synods of bishops. In other words, they were made up of, yes, bishops, but also priests and religious and lay people. In the case of Europe, they're all organized slightly differently. But in the case of Prague, each bishops' conference sent 4 delegates, and they were asked to mix those up. So each of those continental assemblies produced a report. So there were 7 reports, which were then, as you probably guessed, synthesized into the Instrumentum Laboris, or working document for this Synod Assembly. So this was the first of 2 Synod Assemblies of bishops, and the second one, of course, will be October 24. So this Synod Assembly in Rome began or opened the final universal stage. So at each stage of this, we've had, as you know, documents, reports which capture the fruits of listening, which are then synthesized and then, as it were, come back to the church for reflection and response. So there's this principle of circularity. And so we've gone from the local to the continental and now to the universal, but at each stage it's gone back to the local church. And the result of each is a document, but the purpose of these meetings is not to produce documents. The Synod Secretariat has constantly emphasized this. We're not just about producing documents. Documents are the vehicle which enable the process and which capture the fruits. Now, this was a very different Synod of Bishops. It was the 29th Synod of Bishops, which has been held since the 1970s, since the Synod of Bishops was restored by Paul VI after the Second Vatican Council. This is the 29th, but it was very different, both in its composition, who was there, and in the method that it followed. The Old Synod, which is really up to the Synod on Amazonia of October 2019. And the Synod, by the way, has undergone many different changes, and I could give a whole talk on how it's evolved under Francis, but just to understand basically that how it looked was basically the same in each case. It was held, for some reason I've lost my, So it was held in the Aula del Synod, the Synod Hall. And basically the only people who were members, there were a few exceptions, but the only people who were members, that is to say, who could speak and vote, were the bishops. And they sat in this theatre-style format, really looking at the back of the neck of the bishop in front of them. And there they sat for 3 weeks, apart from at the end of each day, they gathered in small groups to revise the document they were given. Bishops were given the chance to speak for a long time, 10 minutes each, on more or less whatever topic they liked, even though they had to technically stick to the overall topic. Described by one bishop to me as like being on a transatlantic flight, but without the movies. So quite long, quite tedious, quite heavy. This synod, as you've probably seen the pictures of, was very, very different. Somebody described it as a banquet hall layout. This is not in the Aula del Synodo, but in the audience hall of the Paul VI, where we had 35 tables laid out. Now, the Pope, he's actually not there in this picture, but to the right, just under where it says Synod New Style, you'll see there's a table that's slightly raised. So he sat at that table when he was in the synod, and that's where also the head people of the synod, the rapporteur general, the secretary general, and so on, would sit. So slightly raised, but basically at also one of these tables, just like everybody else. But the really striking thing was who was at the table. So for the first time, it's still a synod of bishops, but for the first time, we have 25% of the members were not bishops. So there were 365 members in all, including the Pope. So 10 to each table, divided by the 5 languages of the synod: English, Italian, Spanish, French, Portuguese. I say there's still a synod of bishops. So most of those at the tables were bishops, archbishops, cardinals, and patriarchs. But for the first time, we have 25%, as the Vatican described them, not endowed with the episcopal munus. And that meant that they were clergy, they were religious, or they were lay people. And most of them, there were some exceptions, most of them were sent as delegates of the continental assemblies. And I think this is a really important point. So each of the 7 continental assemblies sent 10 delegates, none of whom were bishops. So they were clergy, they were lay people, they were religious, and they were asked to make sure that there were plenty of women included and plenty of some young people as well. We actually had the youngest member of the synod was 19, an American called Wyatt. So of course the headlines, which you probably would have read, which is women get the vote for the first time, which is true, but also so did lay people and so did clergy. And so did deacons. So, but of course, yes, it was striking, of course, that women had the vote and could speak, but could participate fully as members, and everybody took part as equals. So everybody, when they spoke, they were given a maximum of 4 minutes, and that was the same whether you were a cardinal, a patriarch, or a laywoman. Very striking at the beginning of the assembly, we all filed out, we processed, so liturgical procession out into the square, and lay people and religious in the front, and then the clergy came up behind, and then the bishops. So I took this picture literally as we were going up to the central days in St. Peter's Square. So, and it was a very, very striking sight, the whole people of God, as it were, on the move together. And something's happening here. I didn't mean to go back. There we go. So yeah, I mentioned the women, of course, and they were very conscious of their presence, and they were often posing with the Pope and together. They became known as the Synod Mothers, because traditionally Synod members are known as the Synodal Fathers. And many of the bishops said that they behaved much better or differently because the women were there. So the effect of having women in the synod for the first time ever was very, very noticeable and very dramatic. Now, one of the questions that was raised, and it's an interesting question, which is, what is the authority of the Synod of Bishops if 25% of the members are not bishops? What happens, if you like, to the episcopal munus of authority? Important to point out that synods are always consultative in the Catholic Church. They're not deliberative, not like in the Church of England where they legislate and so on. they're consultative. They're called by the Pope essentially to advise him, and the Pope is free to configure the synod as he wants. In other words, if he believes that he's better advised by having a different configuration, then according to the 2018 document Episcopalis Communio, he can do that. And that same document makes clear that in synodal processes, that they're always rooted in a consultation of the sensus fidei, of the sense of faith of ordinary people. And the question then is raised, well, is the authority of a synod, in this case, the Synod of Bishops, reduced or diluted or enhanced by having non-bishops there? Well, it's important to say that the non-bishops were there because they were witnesses of the synodal processes in their countries and at a continental level. So if you like, they were there to witness to what they had seen and heard in the synod. And precisely because of that, it was argued, and it was said to us by the Secretary, that actually the authority of this synod was enhanced. It's a bit like, it's important to make a distinction here between power and authority. You know, a bishop might have the power, but actually his authority to a large extent rests on his legitimacy, you know, the credibility which he has in exercising his power. And that credibility is enhanced if his decisions follow on from, or his discernment follows on from, a process which has involved large numbers of people in prayerful consultation and deliberation. So I thought that was an interesting kind of ecclesiological point. It was a bit like after the Second Vatican Council, when papal primacy was, you know, the Pope exercised his power after his authority after the council in consultation with the bishops, collegiality as it was known. You know, was the Pope's authority reduced by that? No, one would say it's been enhanced since the Vatican Council by being exercised collegially. So one can see, it really felt to me at this assembly that we were seeing now a new stage of the implementation of the council's understanding of authority, to say that actually the exercise of episcopal authority is enhanced when it is rooted in the consultation and the participation of the faithful. Just to point out also, there were people there who didn't come into those categories. 50 members were appointed, for example, by the Pope. But this is the point I wanted you to see just how multipolar now the church is. Sent by the bishops' conferences, you see on the left of the screen, those are the numbers of bishops from the different continents, and you can immediately see, you know, Europe is still, you know, the one with the most bishops, just 48, but actually the Americas has 47, Africa 44, and you have Asia and Oceania. So we see now this is, as a church, this is probably the first synod which I think really reflects this multipolarity of the church. And it was very striking how in the assembly we would have particularly the African bishops saying to the Europeans, look, your priorities are not our priorities, you know, pay attention to what's going on in our world, you know. So this idea that the Western perspective is just now one perspective of many. So in addition to the members, there were also participants, and I was one of them. I was what's known as a theologian, but I would say more important role was those of the facilitators, who were also appointed by the Secretariat. They were the ones who sat at each table, and their job was to ensure that the processes were followed, the conversation in the spirit method above all was followed. And they played a pretty key role because many of the bishops actually were new to the process. Just before I go on to explain that, this is Team UK you're looking at here. So we had John Wilson of Southwark, we had Marcus Stock of Leeds, and in the bottom left-hand corner from Scotland, Bishop McGee of Argyll. In the middle there, Father Jan Novotny is a priest of Westminster, who's been very much involved in the synodal process. And then to his right, Marcus Warner, who was Bishop Warner, who's an Anglican bishop, so he was a fraternal delegate. He's the Bishop of Chichester. In the top of the picture, there am I talking to Nick Hudson, who's an auxiliary bishop of Westminster, who was a papal appointment. And then another expert there, the other Brit expert, was Anna Rowlands, who you see on the bottom right there. But the star of the show in many ways was Father Timothy Radcliffe, Dominican writer, who gave and speaker who gave a magnificent retreat at the beginning. This first time it was preceded by a 3-day retreat. And his talks, if you haven't seen them or read them, I really recommend it. They were absolutely magnificent, and they will be published later in the year. The Pope was available very much during the synod. If you went 20 minutes early, you could find him, shake his hand, give him a hug, give him a gift. Or in the case of the young member, the youngest member, Wyatt Olivier, he asked the Pope to sign a letter excusing him from classes at the University of Wyoming because he'd be so tired when he got back. The format of the working document, as you see there, it was a working document that really was designed to be used. It had basically a series of questions. Those were the questions. And the synod worked through those questions, or the sub-questions, in the course of the 3 weeks. Pretty intense, because all of this happened in the groups. So in each group, you had a facilitator, you had a secretary also to make a note, and you had a rapporteur whose job was to share the fruits of each group with the wider assembly. So the method used was conversation in the spirit, which has become really the synodal method kind of par excellence, which, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with, but you begin in silence. There's a question, of course, which you're seeking to answer, the whole group is seeking to answer. And while you may have thought about that question beforehand, you're really invited to use the prayerful silence at the beginning to, allow your answer to emerge. Then there's a round one in which everybody speaks for no more than 4 minutes. There's no discussion, it's just listening. And then there's further silence where you're invited to listen to the resonances, to how you respond in your heart to what you've heard. So this isn't an intellectual debate. It's not about trying to persuade people of a point of view. Rather, what you're sharing is, if you like, your gift, your insight, your experience, and you're sharing it as a gift. And then somehow the group, by listening to each other's experiences and gifts, starts to become aware of where the Spirit is calling or speaking. So this is the second part was definitely the most challenging for people, not to return to what they originally said, but rather to open themselves to the new thing that was going on in the group. After a further period of silence, there was a third period where there's a freer discussion, where the facilitator invited the group to agree on where they agreed, where there was a convergence. Is there a convergence in the group? Secondly, where are the divergences? Where do we disagree? And there was no attempt to settle these differences. There was no attempt to say, to come to some sort of compromise. They were simply invited to recognize those divergences. And the third thing they were asked to identify were the next steps, the steps forward that would be needed, they felt would be needed to help to move this forward. So each group shared then the fruits of their discernment with the wider group. And there was also a period where individually people could make contributions to the floor. There's a lot of listening. one day I counted that I think we had listened, because the theologians, we were there, listening to the whole thing. I think we listened to sort of 90, 3-minute speeches or something in the course of the day. It got very, very tiring. There were good breaks, but nonetheless, it was quite grueling. And this really does take time, this process. And one of the important things, though, that came out of this, and I'd say in a way, the method was vindicated as the primary synodal method. It's not a method that you can use for resolving things easily. It doesn't allow for, of course, that much discussion. But what it did allow for was for people to understand others' points of view and perspectives, and to recognize that those tensions that exist and the differences that exist between us are not the source of our division. That actually what divides us is something spiritual. It's the lack of trust, the feeling that the other is a rival or my enemy. Cardinal Hollerich put it very well. We're not afraid of tensions, he said. Tensions are part of the process, as long as we consider ourselves to be brothers and sisters walking together. So the great fruit of this method, and I, by the way, I wasn't in the groups myself, but of course in the breaks I was talking to loads and loads of people who were. People were just deeply struck by it and said, you know, I've just come to see this in a whole new different way. You know, I completely disagree with that person, but I totally understood where they were coming from, why they were saying what they were saying. And then to realize that, of course, everybody had something to offer. So you start to realize that actually you're involved in a process which is about coming to a truth which is bigger than all of you. It's not a competition or a rivalry between different points of view, but a coming to a truth together, moving from the I to the we, as it was put. And that was a revelation for people. Of course, it was also at a very kind of human level about building trust, because without trust, you can't really have discernment. And by the way, the same group, the same people who met over those 3 weeks in October, those same people will be back again next October. And that changes everything, because suddenly you say, okay, this is, you know, we're on a journey together over the next year. We're going to be together next October. Again, changes your view. You start to see that you are actually part of the same body, and that changes your perspective. So the fruit of the 3 weeks was the Synod synthesis document, which I'll put a link to in a minute. Not a great work of literature, as you can imagine. It was produced under phenomenally stressful time pressure circumstances. Nonetheless, I think quite a remarkable document. It has 80 proposals and something like 20 commissions it's calling for. It's not seeking to resolve anything, it's seeking to capture the conversation. But what I find quite remarkable is if you look at where we were in October 21 with that document that Rome asked us to all discuss, and you look at this now and you see there really has been a lot of movement, a lot of development in a very, very concrete way. Just from the synthesis report, the vindication of the conversation in the spirit, you know, the effect or the experience of it is quite well captured in this paragraph, that conversation in the spirit also produces a conversion in people. Interesting that conversatio and conversio in Latin, you know, they actually kind of mean the same thing, which is interesting. But to understand particularly that last sentence, you know, that this is about seeking God's will in an authentically evangelical atmosphere. This is really what the whole thing is about. Now, I mean, there were critiques of it made indeed during the assembly. Archbishop Fisher of Sydney, if you're interested, has a reflection on the synod process where he's kind of saying, look, this is good for some things, but we need also to use other methods such as the kind of Dominican tradition of disputation. I don't disagree with that. I don't think anybody would disagree with it, but everybody, I think, would say that as a way of converting people to the synodal process, the CIS worked brilliantly. Partly because it made you aware of those contributions, the spirits, which, if you like, help to build communion, and those which undermine communion. Where people are involved in little power plays, for example, kind of becomes transparent, becomes clear. And we all do it, by the way. We're all prone to power plays. It's not like, but so that was deeply helpful for people. And I mean, the whole process really was about learning to do synodality. This is where people who think that we were gathered in some way to discuss doctrine or settle major questions just don't realize what it was. It was about learning this new way of being. It was not, as the Pope said, a political gathering. We weren't there to debate and vote on and settle questions, but we were there to ask ourselves what the Holy Spirit was calling us to and how we can become more synodal. And that requires patience. It requires allowing differences to emerge. It means give time for everybody to express themselves. But to move through consensus, that we move to decision first by establishing consensus. And this is where there is such a profound difference, I think, with what we're in the Catholic Church trying to do here, trying to construct, and other models, such as, for example, the Anglican model, which is essentially parliamentary, where you have a division, whether it's over women priests or same-sex blessings, where you have debates, arguments over many years often, and then it's settled with a debate, with a debate and a vote. One side wins, the other side loses. The differences are never transcended, but usually they embed themselves. Usually what happens in parliamentary processes is that you get greater polarization over time. What the Catholic Church is trying to do here is to construct a model based on the early church model, but adapted for our times, where we are all about learning to create and operate through consensus. So I think I'll stop screen sharing there. Just to highlight a couple of things from the Synod synthesis. One example of how the global church sort of asserted itself in the course of the Synod was that we ended up in the Synod synthesis document calling for or encouraging the African ecclesial body called SECAM, and here I'm quoting from the document, to promote theological and pastoral discernment on the issue of polygamy and the accompaniment of persons in polygamous unions coming to faith. Now, a lot of people were very surprised by that. It's like, polygamy, what? How can the church come? But in fact, what you realize, and many of us learned this there, I guess I was a bit aware of it before, but it was very striking. It's a massive pastoral question in certain African countries, where people in traditional African societies, if you have some wealth, you probably have a number of wives if you're a man with wealth. And you keep those wives, you sustain, you're their protector and provider. You become a Catholic, and because of course the church prevents polygamy and asks you to be monogamous, then the implication of that is you have to choose one of your wives and get rid of the others. And this, of course, leads to tremendous suffering and injustice. So it's a real question. Now, from a kind of German or European point of view, it's like what? But for Africa, it's very real. Conversely, for so many of the Europeans, the question of same-sex unions, can we recognize love between people of the same sex, and what are the implications of that for the church? From Africa just gets this is not our issue, this is an imposition from on the outside. So it's a good example of where we have to learn as a global church to understand that what is important to one bit of the church is not to another. And to learn that also, but we all in a sense face the same challenges. How do we hold together truth and mercy in polarity? The other thing I just wanted to draw your attention to is the section on women, which of course generated a lot of the heat outside the assembly, Mary McAleese and people like that. Actually, I think what the document does on women is very strong and very good. And I think there's a real shift there, and this came from the women themselves, to say women are not the object of discussion, that they're agents and subjects. And that I think, to me, there was a significant shift. If you read the language and what it says in that section, I think there's a very, very real shift there, which is probably greater than you might perceive from these specific proposals. Anyway, I have other things to say about women, and of course about the question of the ordination to the diaconate, which went in a very interesting direction. But I think I've said enough, and I think I should now hand over to you. While I'm listening to the first questions, I will put the links. Can I put it in the chat, Avril? Is there a general chat?
Yeah, absolutely. Austin, do you want to just stop sharing your screen?
Sorry, I'm so sorry. I thought I had stopped sharing. Forgive me.
That's all right. We were just able to see some of the documents you were sharing. Wow, that was completely fascinating. Thank you so much. And I think, for those of us, the whole rest of the church who weren't in Rome, just to get a sense of what that was like, just to be away for 4 weeks. I can't imagine how grueling it was, just to sort of, be doing that day in, day out. I know when I've done listening experiences, when we had our Austen Assembly, I kind of had to go away and lie down for 3 weeks. It was just exhausting. So I'm in awe of anybody who managed to do that for the full 4 weeks. So I'm just going to invite people, if you've got a question for Austin, can you stick it in the chat, and we will pull as many of them as we can. And a lovely comment there from Father Chris, about helping our understanding of what the gathering was like and what it was for. And I think you're right that what we were seeing in the Catholic press is perhaps not what was actually going on in the room, which is a little bit different. Austin, while people are thinking, I'm going to jump in and ask a question. And I'm really interested in this notion of the global perspective. So, obviously polygamy was a big issue, and some of that, so helpful to say we are a global church. We're not just a Western church with add-ons. And our diocese is beautifully blessed by immigration from all over the world. What was a kind of a standout moment for you where you thought, gosh, the Western church doesn't think like that? Where you sort of came up against an understanding, apart from the kind of the polygamy issues and that kind of thing?
Well, I think for most people in the synod, I mean, the moment I think of greatest difficulty in even beginning a conversation was over the LGBT or gay question, because for many members from many of them were from Africa, but also parts of Eastern Europe, were saying, we can't even accept the term LGBT. The term reflects an ideology of gender fluidity and gender as a construct, which we think is irreconcilable with Catholic anthropology. Okay, and by the way, many kind of more mainstream kind of Catholics around me among the theologians group were saying, they're not wrong. But I think the instinct of sort of Western Europe, Americans and Europeans would be saying, well, if gay people want to call themselves that, we call them that too, out of respect, So in other words, I felt that really wasn't an issue for most of the Europeans and the Americans there, but a massive issue for them, for people from elsewhere. And suddenly I had this sense, I realized that it was really good for us to hear how it is perceived particularly in the developing world, where they see this is being imposed on them by powerful international agencies, and they see it almost as a sort of colonial issue. That was tremendously helpful. I mean, tremendously useful, because I realized, well, of course, we can't even begin to have a conversation about things like same-sex blessings, until you've begun to just identify these gulfs of perception and understanding.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it is that sense of the global church. And I was very struck, like, what other, apart from something like the UN, where else would you see that sort of diversity? And it reflects so much of who we are. So a question for you from Helen Burgess, who leads our women's ministry group. I'm going to say that up front because lots of people on the call will know this. She says, how would you encourage us to take forward the ministry of women? And, sort of what was the feeling really from that first assembly?
Yeah. Well, so just on the question of, I mean, the headline issue of the admission of women to the diaconate, that went in a very interesting direction which was unexpected. And by this is the wonderful thing I think about Synod, these processes, is you can, sometimes you can end up in places where you would never have imagined you would be. But actually, we had a very powerful intervention from one deacon in particular, who was really saying that the diaconate has been distorted. It's become clerical. We see the deacon as a kind of pound shop priest who's up there on the, by the priest in the altar. What is the diaconate? The diaconate, diaconia in the early church, this is about the service of the poor. It's about being in the community, and really calling, therefore, for a transformation or a recovery of a deeper understanding of the diaconate, and a specific call, which you'll see in the synthesis document, for the diaconate to be stripped out from the transition to priesthood. So that the diaconate, there's something called the transitional diaconate. So on the way to becoming a priest, you become a deacon. And okay, if you remove that then do we declericalize the diaconate? In which case, does that change the way we discuss the question of the female? Because underneath all of this is a fear expressed by many women, or an anxiety, that about clericalization. To say, actually, is our task here? Let me put it like this, because this occurred to me quite strongly during the assembly. By expanding the clergy to include, well, I mean, it could include not just women, but obviously married men as well. If we focus on the clergy and we expand the clergy, does that make it harder or more difficult to receive what many see as the great call of the Spirit of this time, which is that the ordinary people, the ordinary faithful, awaken to their baptismal dignity and responsibility for the life and mission of the church. Does that make it harder or easier? I don't have a clear answer to that, but it seems to me that's a question of discernment. In other words, are we about changing things to make them fit into existing structures, or are we about opening ourselves to the new thing which the Spirit is calling us to? So that's where I think the discussion got very interesting. But Helen, sorry, I'm not really answering your question very specifically. How to encourage you to take forward the ministry of women? Well, I think if you read the sections of the document, and there are so many of them, about a culture in the church in which we learn better to recognize the charisms that are being poured out on us all. And we learn as a church to identify, encourage the discovery of those charisms, and then to think about how those charisms can be given expression in ministries. Now, that's true if women have a particular charism, and I that, you know, again, we could discuss that, couldn't we, all evening? But nonetheless, most people would say women at least do things differently and have particular gifts which are being offered to the church at this time, which need to be recognized. How can they find expression in ministry? One example, which did really strike me in the Synod synthesis document, was a call for the ministry of lector to be expanded to preaching. Now, not preaching at mass and so on, because that wouldn't be canonically, but nonetheless, are there people in the parish who feel called to a ministry of the word? And many of them, of course, may well be women, who are called to have a more prominent role in the parish or in the church institution as a preacher. It just seems to me that opens up all kinds of things. One more point. I think the document is full of suggestions and proposals. And I know from talking to the people in the Secretariat that what they would love you all to do is do it. Do it, even though it's not official or allowed, or do it ad experimentum. There's this wonderful expression in the Catholic Church. Do it on an experimental basis and report back. That's how change happens in the church.
Thank you. Gosh, I am loving this notion of something new emerging, something new. Well, is it going to be this or is it going to be that? No, it's going to be something we didn't know. And that's a very exciting, and that prevents that kind of polarization. Because as you say, you don't have winners and losers, you have something new emerging, which is really beautiful. It's a great question here about trust. You know, was there much conversation about trust, or was it the elephant in the room? And did you see how was there a dynamic of that changing over the 3 weeks?
It's a great question. I don't think trust as a topic particularly came up, although it was, of course, implicit in the what was discussed quite a lot, which was the crisis of credibility of authority as a result of the abuse crisis. And that's I think actually that forms really part of the background to this whole synodal process is the search for a kind of authority, you know, which is rooted in credibility and legitimacy, because it is the fruit of processes which involve people, which are about listening to the Spirit. So I think the idea would be, you know, people are more likely to trust the leaders in the church, whoever they are, if the church involves more people in those processes of decision making. But I would say, even though trust wasn't discussed, I think trust was built in the course of that assembly. Very definitely trust was built.
Did see some quite extraordinary photos of unlikely pairings of people coming out.
Oh, and I would look out on the assembly room from my vantage point at the edge and see people sitting together and just thinking, like, you know, in what world would these two people ever be in the same group, you know? And yet then seeing them chatting away, and yeah, and that's the beauty of this process.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Rosalind would like to know, was there much discussion about celibacy and the need to move forwards towards allowing priests to marry in the light of the shortage of priests?
Oddly not. And I found this quite curious, but it was evident in Frascati when we were reading the National Bishops' Conference reports that it didn't come up a lot. It didn't emerge as a headline theme, not like the question of women. And that is interesting. And I think the reason for that is that I think we're probably, as a church, not yet ready to have that discussion. I think it touches, this is me now giving an opinion, all right? So don't, you feel free to discount it, but I think the whole identity of the priesthood is under the microscope in a sense in this process. Or let me put it differently. Priestly identity is in crisis. It's changing. And I think a lot of priests are struggling at the moment, and we can see it even in the synodal process. And I think actually the priesthood itself is going to come under a lot of examination as a result of this. In fact, you can see it at the moment in a lot of the calls for the revision of seminary training. That came up a lot, by the way, in the assembly, the need to revise seminary training, the whole concept of formation. So I think that's probably why it hasn't come up, because it opens up all sorts of other questions. It's there in the document, but it didn't really appear much as a strong issue in the assembly.
I was very surprised actually that it's very little about parish life in the synthesis. And I suppose I was expecting, if you get that many bishops together, that there would have been more conversation about parish life and just, generally our community life and how are we together.
So, I mean, the agenda of the 3 weeks, I mean, there's a heck of a lot to get through. And what we had to get through was defined by the working document. And the working document, say, had those questions, and it was quite a substantial document. And that document, the questions that the document was asking were themselves the fruit of the 2 years of the synodal processes up till now. So to some extent, the agenda was predetermined, one might say. It was predetermined kind of by the people, one might say. But I think there's an awful lot that's implicit in the document about parish life, particularly I think in section 3, which is about structures that are now needed for participation. And Avril, when you decide, give me a couple of minutes on this document, which just landed yesterday, which I didn't have time to get to, which is about how we move from this assembly to the next assembly. We've only just got this document.
That's a perfect segue, because there was a question there, which what have the delegates been charged with doing over the next year? So I'm asking, what have you been asked, but also what have we charged with doing?
We clearly pre-stitched this up. Now I put in the chat, if you look at the second link that I put down there, no, let me just check. Yes, it is the second one there, which I put up at 2015, how to be a synodal church in mission. If you want to just kind of open
share that. Yeah, absolutely.
Or you could open.
Yeah, I'll would you like me to share my screen, show people?
Yeah, you could do that. Yeah, sure.
I'll put the link into the chat for everybody.
I actually had it open. Yeah, if you actually get no, that's the synthesis report, so it's the other link.
Okay. That's fine. Stop sharing there.
I thought I had it open. I do have it open. Do you want me to share it?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay, yeah. Second. Share screen. Can you see this? If I blow it up.
There we go, towards October 2024. Yes.
Yeah. Can you see it now? Yeah. Okay. Good. I've even actually got highlighted a few things. So this is a document which just came out. We were all sent just yesterday, and they've taken their time over this. They've been reflecting over the last month on what they expect now to happen over the next year. And just to highlight a few things, so this is really addressed to the local churches about what the local churches now should be doing or are invited to do over the next year. Reminding us at the beginning in the first two highlighted sections that it's the experience of synodality is the most important thing. It is the experience and reflecting on that experience. And that, as the Pope said in approving this document, the synod is about synodality and not about this or that theme. In other words, we might address all kinds of topics in the course of this, but actually what this is about is synodality itself. It's saying that there are matters that have come up that will need to be addressed, if you like, at a universal level. In other words, by experts, so canonists, theologians, people like that. And they're saying that a list of those topics will be submitted to the Pope. So these are the topics the Pope will be told that will be studied. And then a report on the progress that they've made will be made next October. So there is not an expectation that these commissions necessarily will have finished or concluded. Okay, but they will be, as it were, reporting to the. So that's what's happening at a sort of a high level. But what they want is for us all to engage in the big question there, which they've put, which is how can we be a synodal church in mission? Synodal Church in Mission is the title of the synthesis document. So this is about identifying the paths we can follow and the tools we might adopt in our different circumstances in order to carry this out, okay? And they're reminding us about the missionary option of Evangelii Gaudium, that the church needs to be converted to a missionary way of being. 1.1, they're saying that the guiding question, how can we become a synodal church in mission, needs to be addressed on two levels. One, how at each local church, so this is us in our diocese and in our parishes, how can we enhance the differentiated co-responsibility and the mission of all the members of the people of God? So if you unpack that from church speak, differentiated co-responsibility means we're not trying to say there's no difference between priests and laity or between bishops and priests. We all accept there is that we have different roles and functions within the church. But nonetheless, how can we embrace the notion of co-responsibility? We are all responsible for the mission of church. So what ways of relating, what processes, what decision-making can we renew or bring about to enable that? So I think that's a key question for everybody, and one that I think can't be avoided. I think everybody needs to answer that question. And secondly, how can these relationships be articulated to find a dynamic balance between the dimension of the church as a whole and its local roots? So that's a slightly more question really about what's proper to the local, what's proper to the national, and so on. But I think it's the first question is really key for all of us.
Yeah.
And then they say that they would like each local church to carry out a further consultation. They're not saying we want to reopen the whole synodal process, but they're going to actually consult people to say, well, what is the best way that we can do this over the next year? Okay. And then they're asking us to basically to have projects and initiatives which involve the whole people of God. They keep stressing this. Activities, studies, celebrations, listening to minority populations. Basically, how do we include, listen to, invite to participate people on the margins of the church? And they're really, really strong on this. There is a feeling, I think, that the first stage of the synod didn't do that because we were too busy, frankly, in organizing our own meetings. But they're really keen. This is the missionary element. How can we, in our parishes and our dioceses, can we organize initiatives, projects, listening exercises that bring in people from the outside? And then there's some specific stuff there about how this is then to be submitted to and presented to the Synod Secretariat, which you can read from themselves. So I hope that's helpful. Stop share.
Excellent. Well, there we go, people. That is a programme of work to be getting on with. I mean, I will say, actually, in our diocese that we are already trugging on with some of this stuff. So, you know, our Outreach to the Marginalised Working Party, which was Jim Hannigan and Father Kevin O'Driscoll, kind of got started on this work, are unstoppable, really, because they're so passionate about reaching the margin. So we will have projects carrying on with that. And I know Jim's very keen to talk to anybody who wants to do that in their own parish. We have a project on thinking about bringing the lay voice into all the levels across our diocese, including a new diocesan pastoral council, but also including at parish council level and at parish level. So we are starting to imagine some of those. And actually, that whole question of co-responsibility for me is the absolute centre of how do we go forward, and we're addressing that too. So we've got a project around thinking about that too. So that's always nice to know when you think, yeah, we're on track with Pope Francis. We're all right. We're all right. So that's quite, so watch this space, and I'll take some time over Christmas to have a look at this and reflect on it, and we'll get something out into parishes in the new year to enable parishes to kind of grapple with it in their own way. But Austen, thanks so much, because I didn't even realize that had come out. So that we've got that hot off the press, ladies and gents, straight from the Synod delegates' mouth, as it were. I can see that we have run over time. I want to ask you one very last question, because it was such a lovely question that came out, which is just, how did it feel? Like, how did it feel to be there? Give us a little flavor of that before we finish up.
I think the word I'd use is privilege. I felt privileged to be to be involved with a process which it felt like it is making history, and just as somebody who kind of writes about the church and who often, just to be involved at that level was a real privilege. I would also use the words frustrating, grueling, painful, challenging. I mean, and particularly in the theologians group, it was actually very difficult at times. The mechanics of it, and Avril and I have often talked about this, the mechanics of the synodal process have often been very, very clunky and actually very unsynodal. So there are all kinds of paradoxes involved. But how did it feel? It felt like a privilege, and it felt that, and in a way, everything I've just said, the fact that we produced what we produced, and that the spirit at the end was one of joy and unity, to me was a sign that this really was of the Spirit. And I felt, okay, this is probably what it was like in the Council of Jerusalem described in Acts chapter 15. So almost to be connected by an umbilical cord to the early church, I actually did feel that viscerally, and that was a great privilege. Again, privilege. Thank you. As it has been, and to be with you tonight, it has been a great joy. And thank you for having me. And please invite me back next year after the next one.
Absolutely. Well, I think a lot of what you just said there was a feeling that lots of people reflected back after our Austen Assembly, that feeling of privilege, that feeling of joy, but also, blimey, this is really hard work, getting into those conversations, talking about difficult topics, holding tensions around tables, all of that part of synodality. So again, really wonderful to know that kind of something of our experience was being reflected in that global gathering in Rome. Well, ladies and gents, what a fabulous evening. Thank you so much to Austen for sharing that with us, and a real glimpse into something very special. And I agree. I think this is such a moment, a special moment, a kairos moment for the church at the moment. So it's really wonderful to have heard that from you. So thank you, Austen. Thank you, everybody, for your time this evening. We've been able to record this, so I'll get this put onto the diocesan website, but I'll share the link with you, with everybody who registered, and with all the Synod delegates, and you can share it around. It's not just for Assembly delegates, it's for everybody to be able to share it. So thank you, thanks everybody, and good night.
Thank you.